Hi, my love. Welcome back to Cultivate. My name's Bree, and I own April and Fritz, a wedding and event floristry business based in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm also a business coach for florists. So, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited that you are here. Today, I want to talk about something that completely changed the way that I think about consultations. I think we spend a lot of time trying to improve our businesses by changing what we do, right? We update the template, we change the process, we learn to ask better questions. But sometimes the thing that's affecting the outcome isn't what we're doing, it's how we're showing up while we're doing it. And I love this whole idea because it means that the internal work that we can do can have a profound impact on our business externally. So today we're going to talk about congruence and specifically how the smallest moments of incongruence with a customer or a client or in a consultation, which is what we're going to speak about mostly today, can really affect whether a couple or client trusts you enough to book or make a purchase. But before we get into that, I want to share a story with you because this is sort of the moment where I realized that I needed to start thinking about consultations differently. I was once in a consultation and I had a bride ask me whether a hanging installation that she had saved on her inspiration board could work within her budget. And I responded straight away. I'm like, yep, absolutely, no problem. We can make that work. Now, I didn't get the booking and I replayed that conversation, that whole consultation for a very long time afterwards. Every answer, every recommendation, every question. And interestingly, nothing really stood out as obviously wrong at the time, which, to be honest with you, somehow made it worse for me. But what I eventually narrowed it down to was the moment where I had responded before I had even given myself a chance to think about it. With this bride, I had basically just said yes before I had asked a single question about scale or about the budget or anything else really. And so what I came to learn off the back of that is that trust is not only lost through big, obvious mistakes or pushy sales tactics. We've spoken about that a lot on the podcast, but trust can also be lost in those moments where you are trying to be helpful or agreeable or reassuring or professional. And so that is what I really want to get into today. We all have that experience, right? You hear yourself say something and instantly you're like, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that. But by the time that you notice, it's already out there. And it's almost like the words just sort of pour out of you before you've even given them a conscious thought. You say something, and again, it's like immediately you just know that it doesn't reflect what it is that you know or think or believe or feel. And I personally did a lot of deep reflection on this. And what I came to realize was that it was so much easier for me just to agree with this bride and say yes to the hanging installation in the moment than admit that I didn't know whether we could actually do the hanging installation yet. Now, I really do wish that I could tell you that this was just an isolated incident and that, I learned my lesson. But the truth is that I noticed this same kind of pattern in lots of different consultations. It would show up as different versions, but it was still the same underlying thing. And I think what was most frustrating for me is that up until that point in time, I had been continuously asking myself, like, how could I be saying all of the right things, everything that a bride wanted to hear? I was literally a yes man and still not get the booking. The answer I came to learn is congruence. Now, congruence is the alignment between what is happening on the inside and what you are expressing on the outside. So it's the idea that when you are in congruence, the inside and the outside match. And in the context of a consultation, congruence really means that what you notice, what you think, what you know, what you are uncertain about, and how you behave are all telling the same story. They are all communicating the same thing. And in essence, what that means is that nothing is being performed, right? So if incongruence sounds like, absolutely no problem, we can make that work, when I wasn't certain that I could, then congruence might have sounded like, before I respond, I just want to make sure that I understand the full picture because I want to give you an honest answer. One was said because I was essentially desperate for the booking, right? I wanted her to like me. I wanted her to choose me. The other reflects what I genuinely thought and felt at the time. And the experience of those two responses is completely different for a client because we know just from interacting with other human beings on the planet, right, that we don't only listen to what someone says. We read everything at the same time. their tone, their energy, their timing, questions, all of it, right? So it's all being processed by our nervous system in real time, even when we're not aware of it. And that is exactly what your client is going through in a consultation as well, which just means that you can think that you are coming across as confident and professional and warm, but if you're shaking like a leaf and your voice is cracking and you're rigid, what you are communicating on the outside doesn't match. And while a couple or a client might not be able to name it specifically, like nobody walks away from a consultation or an interaction and says they weren't congruent, but they'll feel it, right? And that is exactly what shapes whether they decide to trust you. It's why they might say something like, I don't know why, I just feel like the other florist would be better for us. And you know the feeling. You meet someone and something is just off, right? They are saying all the right things. They are seemingly pleasant and perfect and all of that, but something in you just isn't buying it, and you can't quite explain why. You kind of feel this resistance. And then, maybe you meet somebody else and within 30 seconds, you feel completely at ease. You trust them before they've even done anything to earn it. So psychologists have studied something called thin slices, which is really just the impressions that we form from very small amounts of observed behavior. And what their research found is that those impressions formed almost instantly, like we're talking seconds, can reliably predict whether trust will form between two parties and whether one person will ultimately be chosen by another. And again, your client is having that exact experience in the consultation. So while your client is not consciously analyzing your tone or your timing or anything like that, something in them is. And so the impressions that form from those thin slices become part of the story that they tell themselves as to whether or not they trust you, long before they have seen anything about a design, your pricing, your contract, any of that. So the more those things like your tone, your timing, your behavior, your expressions, all of those different pieces are not in alignment with one another, the more work that the client has to do to basically make sense of that interaction, right? And the more effort that they have to put in to make sense of that interaction is exactly where doubt starts to form. Because when a client is deciding who they trust with their wedding, even a small amount of doubt can influence who they choose. Because while something like price can tell a couple what the wedding will cost, congruence tells them whether they feel like they can rely on you to deliver it. And that's not really a feeling that you can manufacture because we are intelligent beings, right? Like the buyer today is more sophisticated and more intelligent than ever. And so a client can sense when you are just telling her what she wants to hear, and it makes you less trustworthy, not more. So at this point, you should have a pretty clear understanding of what congruence is and what it's not. But why do we become incongruent? Why do we say one thing when we mean another, or hold our tongue when we know we should say something? Where exactly does our congruence start to break down? And what I've found from reviewing my own consultations and those of the florists that I coach, it always seems to show up in the same place. And that is any point when the consultation or the interaction starts to get a little bit uncomfortable. Now, you can define discomfort however you like, but I often see florists get uncomfortable in moments where, maybe there's a moment of silence that lasts just that little bit too long, or the budget doesn't match the vision and you're thinking, oh my God, how am I going to navigate this? Or the bride can't explain what she wants and she's looking at you like you should already know, but you don't. And so you start to feel that pressure in the moment. These are the kind of moments where something in you just reaches for some kind of relief. And so it's not necessarily a conscious decision, but more of like a reflex. And I want to be really specific about what that reflex looks like. So using the same examples as before, if there's a moment of silence that lasts that little bit too long, maybe you jump in to fill the silence. Or that budget conversation comes up and maybe you start to steer the conversation back towards the flowers. Or, you agree to something before you've really thought it through, like I did with the installation. But that behavior is actually just trying to move you away from the discomfort that you're experiencing in the moment. And that is exactly the kind of behavior that creates more uncertainty for the client. So you might feel relief because the difficult moment has passed, right? Like you got through it, you navigated in some kind of way, but the client is left with more questions about the interaction. Like, why did they not stop talking the whole time? Or we didn't chat about the budget. Like, that's super weird. And that is where the doubt starts to settle in. Now, I do need to say, obviously, I think there are moments that absolutely call for these sort of responses, and it makes total sense. But I think the real question is why you're doing it. If you are doing it to serve the couple versus trying to soothe some sort of discomfort, then they are two very different situations. And what I've noticed is that eventually this behavior really does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would show up to a consultation, try to perform some version of competence or professionalism or expertise when maybe things got a little bit intense for me or I wasn't really sure what to do next, not get the booking, wonder what went wrong, and then try even harder next time. And so I would end up with these really down moments on myself because I was like, I'm showing up as the professional. I'm showing up as the most capable version of myself and they're still not booking. Like, why is that? Must mean something about me or my work or my value. And I would often end up saying things like, I'm just not very good at this. I shouldn't have done this. When in reality, it was just that I was out of congruence because I was performing in some way. And the couples that I was meeting with, because they are smart, right, were feeling that in some way. And so when you do feel that pull, right, the urge to fill the silence, to give a fast answer, to agree before you've thought it through, pause just for a moment. And I just want to encourage you to ask yourself, am I responding to what the client needs right now? Or am I responding to make myself feel more comfortable? And I think you'll find that the question of whether or not you're in congruence or out of it lives inside that question. Now, it is worth noting too that sometimes the most congruent response is not going to be the most reassuring one. It might sound like, I want to make sure that I give you an honest answer on that. Do you mind if I ask a couple of questions? And I think what's interesting is that there's a massive misconception that if you do that, that you are somehow less of a professional. But I would actually argue that you're taking the time to give your client the most accurate answer and honest answer. And that actually makes you more of a professional because it signals that whatever recommendations you're about to make, they are more considered, not just the first response that keeps the conversation moving. Now, I do acknowledge that understanding what congruence is and actually practicing it in the moments when everything in you just wants to let it go are two very different things, particularly when the pressure is on. So I just want to invite you to read a little bit more on this topic by following the link in the show notes to one of my essays on the tall poppy, which is called Why Brides Trust Some Florists More Than Others. There I go into a lot more specifics around congruence, why it tends to break, what is actually driving our behavior underneath those moments, and what it looks like to actually come back to congruence. But for today, I will leave you with this. After your next consultation, notice where you sounded more certain than you felt. Notice where you were tempted to answer before you fully understood the question. And notice where you recognized something important and decided not to act on it. And then ask yourself, what were you trying to protect yourself from in that moment? Because the more quickly that you can start to notice yourself moving in or out of congruence, the more choice you have to make about what happens next. So if you found this episode helpful, share it with a florist friend who you think would benefit from it. The more we can have these conversations together, the better we all get. So I'll see you next week. Thanks so much for being here.